Ooh. We should be live in just a moment, and I'm going to make sure that we are. Then, you and I are having a chat. It looks like we're live now, so welcome! Hello! I am your Saturday night, and welcome to your Saturday night. It's a good time. It's a very good time. And we're actually here to talk about indie film, crafting your indie film, and making all of those little bits work together. Now, we've joined each other before and we've discussed things in regards to filming and kind of a breakdown of getting into indie film. But, you know, there's just so much to talk about. There really is. So, get this little thing going over here. So, what we're going to talk today about is kind of the process of crafting that film before you make it, other than all the steps as far as going ahead and the whole shebang, other than the filming, there is actually a crafting aspect. Now, if you are looking to get into indie film, you're an indie filmmaker, or you're aspiring to be, well, congratulations, you're also a director. So, welcome aboard. It's a fun club, it's a good time, and that's exactly what you should expect to have. Despite the fact that there's a lot of work involved in creating an indie film, there's also a lot of fun, a lot of creativity, and all sorts of aspects which just help solidify that this is a creative process. Now, you as the director, well, see, a director's style is the manner in which their personality is expressed in film, their creativity is expressed in film. And every element and every decision and combination of decisions and elements used are a representation of the personality and the creativity and the expression of you, the director. And that's a pretty important aspect in and to itself. Now, we've talked a little bit about the creative process, and we've talked a little bit about the the technical aspects. But there is one really big thing that needs to be discussed, and that's crafting your film. And when it comes to crafting your film, you're going to need to consider certain things: themes, elements, story, characters. Uh, Good evening, Six in the House. And as you make all of these decisions, well, you're making a lot of decisions about what your story is. So we're going to start at the top as far as all of this goes, and the top is, you know, what story do you want to tell? And I think that's incredibly important, figuring out what story you want to tell. And the moment you've figured out what story you want to tell, that's the moment that you're actually going to go ahead and you're going to get that process to a point where you now have a direction. What is the story that you are looking to tell others when you create a film? And we're going to take 2 seconds to go ahead, and I'm going to let you know I've just gotten a couple more things that have come through. I got finalist in a film festival, and I got semi-finalist in the Sydney Independent Short Film Festival. So things are going pretty good. Feeling good. I'm feeling great. The kind of the speed by which new things are occurring as far as my own film career, it's excellent. It's absolutely excellent. And I want to go ahead and give to everyone who watches, listens, whether you're watching now or you're watching on my film YouTube later, thank you so much. Uh, I want to impart these skills and this knowledge to anyone who might be watching. So that's why we're getting together. That's why we're having this fun conversation. So let's get right back into it. And, our big topic here, thank you so much. Our big topic here is crafting your film. Now, to craft your film, you first have to craft your story. And that it is not as big an undertaking as it would seem. Crafting your story is really a step-by-step process. And as I was saying, one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is, what is the story that you want to tell? What do you want to put out there for others to see or to hear about? What, what little or what little or big things do you want others to think about? And that's the thing, because the moment you are putting a film out, or the moment you're putting a story out of any sort, you want the audience to get something, don't you? And that's what we're going to discuss. Uh, so there's a lot of tried and true stories, and there's a large number of things which are pretty common. They occur over and over again, and there's some safety in that in many ways. The first way is that there's a safety in a story that's been told. Now, in stories that have already been told, there's still so much to get out of them. So, let's talk first about trope stories. And if you decide to do a trope story, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, it can be encouraged, and it is a wonderful thing to put out into the world. Because things become tropes or cliches because they have a commonality in our understanding. So, question one on what story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell a story that's already been told, but you just want to tell it your way? There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, big big pictures, Hollywood, they do it all the time. Television and movies, they're constantly giving us stories that we already know. They're twisting them and sometimes putting a spin on it or adding in sub-stories, or they're trying to give us a different perspective, but nonetheless, they are giving us stories we already know so often. And a lot of them are quite simply tied into a concept of theme. And these themes are pretty universal and can be played across cultures and across the world and be pretty well received. Things such as love stories. Uh, you have love story is a classic, and it has a lot of possibility. And then, of course, you have the unlikely hero. Now, the unlikely hero is also incredibly popular, and it's a perfectly good story and one worth telling. You have tons of good examples, whether they're in sports film or in traditional fantasy, where the unlikely hero is an incredibly popular theme. In sports movies, it usually goes in the terms of the underdog. You could consider something like the Mighty Ducks. That is an unlikely hero story because the underdogs, the Mighty Ducks, should not win, but they do. Spoiler if you haven't seen it, but it's been around for what, almost 30 years? So I think we're okay. Unlikely heroes are actually a really good place to start, and they're a really strong place to start. And if you want to tell that kind of story, I would actually recommend that you go ahead and you lean into all the source material. Unlikely heroes go back centuries, I would think. Um, I could be wrong, but I mean, even if you look at J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, at the center of those is an unlikely hero in Frodo Baggins and Bilbo Baggins. Neither one of them is exceptionally heroic or someone you would expect to be the hero of the story, but nonetheless, they are. And they are very much underdogs in many ways because they do face a lot of doubt from those around them. So, you can go ahead and you can tell an underdog story, an unlikely hero story, and it's perfectly acceptable, perfectly good. Now, you don't have to choose necessarily one theme, but let's go ahead and talk about a couple of others. Because obviously there's the love story and then there's the unlikely hero, and these are very, very common. They are so common that they aren't just, yes, exactly, that's what we love about them, that they are just they're so relatable to everyone. Um, and they're so tried and they're so true. But I mean, there's a large number of kind of base stories you can work from and base themes. So you have the love story, and the love story comes in several kinds. One is the star-crossed lovers, which of course predates Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is pretty popular for that with Romeo and Juliet, and that gets played again and again up until even like West Side Story. Uh, and West Side Story is still a star-crossed lovers story, and love stories have that kind of fun to them because you can go ahead and you can take something that's been done again and again, and you can do it and you can make it new. That's just a wonderful start to what we're talking about here. So we have our love story and we have our unlikely hero story, but we also have the revenge story. And the revenge story, again, incredibly popular. And it comes in many different flavors. Now you could go to the Far East, and in Japan they have I think it's called the I'll forget the number, but it's the story of the Ronin, and the Ronin is a revenge story, and then there's modern takes on it that Japan has continuously used for a very long time, even going as far as into their cinema, like the blind swordsman's cane sword. Now, the blind swordsman's cane sword is, in many ways, a revenge story, but it is also our next topic. However, before we get onto that, revenge stories come in many sorts. If you look at modern cinema here in the US, you can always look at something incredibly formulaic and trope-laden, but also very satisfying, and that's Kill Bill. Kill Bill is a revenge story, through and through uh, and also inspired by a great number of other movies. You can look at certain Clint Eastwood westerns to find similar revenge stories, or you could look at something like Kung Fu, the original one, which was an adventure story which was underpinned by a revenge story. You get the revenge story a lot less than you get the adventure story, but that doesn't change that one of the themes of it actually is a revenge story, which is kind of interesting. And now it's played in a very different way, too, because the series Kung Fu, it starts with the destruction of a monastery, which sets Kwai Chang Caine out onto his adventures into the world, but there is kind of a heart of it, which is Kwai Chang Caine seeking a form of revenge. Now, it's not revenge in the traditional style, it's not bloody satisfaction, but it is a revenge story because he is trying to avenge or or seek some sort of justice out in the world. So, in some ways, and one can argue about it, and I will accept all and any arguments. However, in many ways, even something like that where there isn't a tangible revenge storyline, there is an underpinning of the revenge storyline, which is part of the intrigue, as part of the fun. So I know that's an outlier, but it's a very powerful one, and it's a very good one. Now, revenge stories, of course, also come in many flavors and many kinds, but we can get all sorts of different information from each one of them. But of course, carrying on, so now we've covered a few basics. We have love stories, we have unlikely heroes, we have revenge. Uh, we also have the classic hero's journey. Now, a hero's journey is super classic, and a hero's journey usually involves some unbelievable peril that's unavoidable, and a hero who must rise and face said peril. There is a distinct formula for this, and there's actually been papers written about the hero's journey and how it follows a very particular cycle, and we're not going to get into that. The point is, that is also a choice, and if you're interested in telling a hero's journey, there's a well plotted out um, formula which is so tried and true that you can overlay it onto just about any hero's journey story, and it's pretty accurate as far as the way the plot's supposed to move. And there's also something fun about that, because that means that you can actually overlay the hero's journey story over everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh um, to the Division of Ra and Horus, all the way up to something more modern like the Dark Tower series from Stephen King, and the hero's journey. You can take any one of the other themes and put it in there, but the hero's journey is incredibly simple as far as the build style, and you can rearrange a lot of the elements inside it, and it's still a hero's journey. But there's a whole plot out of how that's supposed to be done, and it works regardless. Now, the great thing is almost any single one of these can be turned into different genres, so we don't have to worry about the genre. First off, we have to decide the story. And I'm not going to cover everything that you could possibly do, but that's a pretty good list right there. I mean, you have the unlikely hero, you have love, you have revenge, you have the hero's journey. You can make it so much more. There are so many more choices, but that's a pretty good starter. If you're just going to get into the concept of telling a story, you have a good starter right there. It's an amazing start, and there's a lot of options there. If you want to look at more things, there are more things. You can always go to the route of maybe you want something less palpable. Maybe you want to take your primary theme as the existential crisis. Now, the great thing about the existential crisis is it can be played out in so many different ways and in so many different mix matches of everything else that we've just talked about. But the existential crisis is an amazing thing, and you'll see this in a lot of independent films, whether they're adventures or romances or revenge. You can stick it into anything else and it works. 1984. Okay, so yes, absolutely wonderful. So 1984, there's a lot of thematic elements in that, and that is worth breaking down almost on its own time. I know people have tried to make movies out of it, but it's a difficult thing to properly capture because, you know, it's a forewarning. And forewarning is also a theme that you can go with in a movie. So, you know, that's a choice, that's an option. But with the existential crisis, you're going to focus on what's happening to the character and inside the character and how the world is perceived through that. So it doesn't matter necessarily if the other characters around are good or bad or indifferent. What matters is giving a perspective through film where you are seeing the world through the eyes of the character. So an existential crisis or an existential film really needs to focus on one viewpoint, and you can frame it so that the viewer can actually see the truer intentions of others, but it's all filtered. All of it's filtered. So even if someone is benevolent and good and wants to help the main character, there's going to be a filtering out so the viewer can see that benevolence, but it's always really far off at arm's reach. You know, there's a lot that can be done, uh, and you can take that the complete opposite direction where there's just a void between these things. Here's benevolence, here's decay, here's our person in the center, and they don't know what to make of all of it. So yet another potential theme and concept that you can run with. You can go broader, you can go smaller, you can go so many different ways, but ultimately, once you choose a theme, now we can start to craft your story. And that's one of the fun things. So, you know, beyond all of that, there are other choices. Now, once you have a theme, you're really going to have to choose a genre. You don't necessarily have to do it in those orders. You might have a genre in mind you want to work with, and then you pick a theme afterwards, or you might have a theme you have in mind and you pick a genre afterwards. But genre is just as important as theme because no matter what story you want to tell, you have to decide what the voice of that story is. So we're going to step away from the theme for a moment and we're going to discuss genres. And there are many, but we're not going to get too deep. We're going to stay pretty surface level here because most genres have subgenres. And at the top of the list, I mean, obviously you can go action. Action movies have a wide range that they can take. You can go revenge, you can go love, you can go existential, uh, you can go hero. You know, so you have a lot of choices with an action movie. And the action movie also brings up also subgenres which can be explored and that adjust the theme appropriately. But the same is true for all the other genres we're about to talk about. So for an action movie, you know, that distinctly gives a voice to how your story is going to be told, because it's going to be told through a visual language which is very different than the visual language of the other genres. An action movie is going to be told through just that physical action. So if you decide to take whatever your theme is and create an action movie, you also have to understand that that means that there's a very particular mode which through that story is going to be told. Dialogue suddenly becomes very second place Story doesn't have to become second place, but dialogue can take second place to the physical actions which tell the story, which is very important. And each of these things is important to its own genre, style, theme. Each just lends that next level. Now, of course, right after action, yes, we must acknowledge horror, because horror does have lots of subgenres, and it can be taken in many ways, but it also is going to direct our story very particularly. Now, a love story can be put within a horror story, because, of course, our genre and our theme don't necessarily have to be perfectly melded. What has to happen is that the way you put the story together has to come together in such a way so that, you know, it all works. Now, if one is to write a horror story with a love theme, that doesn't necessarily mean that that love has to be a good thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. Um, but it also doesn't necessarily get a happy ending. Which again is going to inform your tone and the way everything works. Each one of these steps you take in decisions on how the film is going to build, the story is going to build, it's going to be incredibly important. So if one is to take horror, you can mix horror and the other genres and the other themes all very easy. It's all about how you put it together. And if horror is your primary genre, you have to keep in mind that revenge horror or existential horror or a love story wrapped up in a horror story, each one of these is going to flow in a different way. And yes, if you have a horror story, if the hero doesn't survive, that's par for the course, isn't it? Though if the hero does survive, then you can make a sequel. But you don't need the hero to survive to make a sequel. Sometimes you just have to have the villain survive to make a sequel for horror. But that brings us to a subgenre of horror, which is serialized or, you know, sequel horrors. And there's, again, absolutely nothing wrong with that. Many people pull it off very well. Many people do not. But it's okay. It's perfectly fine. Because we're exploring the concepts of what is the story, what's the story you want to tell, and once you have an idea, you move forward. So you can go action for genre, you can go horror for genre, you can go comedy. Comedy, again, is going to completely change everything. You can go serious comedy. Existential comedies are often dramas more than they're comedies, but they are funny. And of course, that's the black comedy or the dark comedy, and it's a choice that you can make. But if you want to go comedy, you can go many different directions, and comedy has as many different subgenres as anything else. I personally like dramedies because dramedies are wonderful. But of course, that just leads us on further. But to go back, if you have comedy in mind and you want to go love story, I'm sure you can name a bunch of different comedic, like rom-coms, as it were, rom-coms that you've seen or heard of, and romantic comedies work very well. But so do horror comedies, trauma comedies, existential comedies, action comedies. So comedy is best when it's gone ahead and linked up with another main genre, but you don't have to. You most certainly don't have to. You can go historical as another big genre, and again, historical can be tied in with lots of other types of stories. So all of these work very well weaving into one another. But if you're going historical, that does require that you take a lot more things uh, into thought, into concern, into planning. I've actually heard it said that doing a period piece, from the pre-industrial era is easier than doing something, say, if you wanted to do a period piece set in like 1995 or 1940, it's easier to do something set in the 1700s because there's such a gap of connection, culturally speaking, that it's easier for people to see mistakes made in a movie that's supposed to be the 1940s than one in the 1640s. And that's very true. You don't necessarily know what things are supposed to look like, how people were, unless you're very invested into history, in which case you'll be the person, like me, who's in the back of the theater complaining because they're getting things wrong. Uh, yes, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, um, there's all these periods of time that if that's what you want to do, you really have to take that into consideration. You really have to understand if you're doing a historical film, what you're doing, how you're doing it. It doesn't have to be historically accurate, but it should be historically believable. And believability is actually the most important thing as far as a historical movie because we have to suspend the disbelief of the viewer. But, to carry on further and to take a couple more steps, obviously you can go drama, just straight drama. And dramas play in all sorts of good ways. So you can do a drama love story. I believe a really good example of this is The Notebook, which is also historical. It's a historical movie because it's a period piece. So that is a drama love story historical period piece, and it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. They took a lot of consideration into the filming, the set design, the costumes, and how everything worked together, and they made a really compelling historical dramatic love story. Uh, you really get invested in it. You really want to know what's happening. Now, of course, in your genres, you can also go fantasy or science fiction. Now, I'm putting these two side by side because fantasy and science fiction have a lot in common. A lot of people might get upset about that, but that's okay. You're allowed to get upset the fact that I put those side by side because science fiction and fantasy have one big tie-in, and that is that you can do anything you want. So science fiction and fantasy, you can do almost anything you want. Almost anything you want. Fantasy, you can get away with a lot more. Science fiction, you can get away with a little bit less, but there are definitely times where this is not true. An example, Flash Gordon. Amazing movie. Flash Gordon is great. It is far more fantasy than science fiction, but it is considered a science fiction movie. And yes, to take that into account, uh, thank you, Six. Movies should be about fun, getting together, and all that time because you want to have fun. You want to sit down, uh, preferably watch a movie with someone else, enjoy something else together. Um, and you as a filmmaker want your audience to have fun. You want people to sit down, watch the whole thing through, and no matter what your intentions were when you made it, definitely you want that full on You want a bunch of people sitting on a couch or sitting in a theater, like fully engaged in whatever you've produced. So that is a big part of it. That most certainly is. Now, science fiction and fantasy, both great choices. And again, you can mix these in all sorts of other ways. I will say existential science fiction can be some of the most fun. Blade Runner, for example, incredibly fun movie. Or you could take something which is both a hero's journey and an existential story, such as Dune. No, so Frank Herbert's Dune is marvelous literature, and it was also a marvelous movie. I think the original time that they did it was a mini series. I could be wrong, and if I am, that's okay. Uh, it was it was excellent. Frank Herbert's Dune, wonderful existential science fiction. It was also drama. It was hero's journey. It had all of these great aspects. So you can see how each thing that you pick can stack on top of the other thing. You're picking your direction, your motive, your motivation. You're deciding how your story works. How does your story work? And that's what we're talking about right now. How does your story work? So when you want to craft a story, you're still thinking about these things, the themes, the genres, how you're going to interweave these things. There really are so many different themes that you can choose, so many different genres and subgenres. I like things like psychological horror. I, I really like romantic comedies. I like action movies. And I like fantasy and science fiction movies. And science fiction movies have a huge um, rebirth right now, as far as there's a lot more science fiction than a lot of people take into note. Because most, if not all, of no, I'll correct myself. Most of the current, my cat's talking. Um, most of the Marvel movies are science fiction hero movies, and they're super popular right now. The idea of people using science and technology, most of which is rooted in some sort of reality, to become heroes, yes. So science fiction right now, really big, whether or not people realize it. And if you do realize it, great. Take advantage of this time. And if you want to make a science fiction movie, this is your time. Science fiction is huge. Probably want to make a science fiction hero movie, but you don't have to. And there's tons of great science fiction robot movies right now, or artificial intelligence movies. And science fiction and artificial intelligence, that just goes hand in hand. You know, it's great. Um, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Sorry, I can't do that right now. So, I'm sorry, Dave. But there's just so many different great things that can be done. Now, there are things that personally I would shy away from just because they're like so done that we might need to give them a few more years of rest. But that's me, and I won't get into that because that's just my opinion, and those are things that I don't want to particularly do. Now, when it comes to a wonderful concept, which is the dramatic horror, dramatic horror is a thing, and you get a lot of that with M. Night Shyamalan, dramatic horror. Uh, it's less psychological horror than it is story driven, and each one kind of takes its own different avenues. Hi, Silver Fox. I'm so glad you're here. So yes, like an M. Night Shyamalan movie, that is, most of them are dramatic horrors, but most of them aren't like proper horror movies. They are very story driven. They're very about the experience, and in a lot of ways, I consider an M. Night Shyamalan movie kind of like an amusement park ride. You do not necessarily know what's going to happen, but that's the ride you're on. Baba Yaga, can you can you let me talk? Do you have to talk over me? My cat has to talk over me. See, I stop and she stops. That's brilliant. Oh, yeah, my cat just has to talk over me while I'm talking. That's just the way it goes. And so as we're going through, just to get back on topic, we're gonna pick our theme, we're gonna pick our genre, and once we have these things, we have the root of how our story is gonna go. Subgenres, there are so many of them that it's really hard to actually talk about it all. But my encouragement would be to take several potential themes, see how they work together, several potential genres, see how they work together, and then decide um, what you want, how you want it to work. If you want to make a love story, make a love story. Decide, is it a science fiction, a fantasy, a drama, a comedy? Is it an action movie? Romantic action, I can't think of any good examples right off the top of my head, but I think that's something that we should get more of right now. Um, Correction, I can think of a really bad example, which is Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And in a lot of ways, at the root of Mr. and Mrs. Smith is a couple which is actually having difficulties. Their relationship is faltering, and then they come back together. If you ignore the spies, if you ignore the action, Mr. and Mrs. Smith is a different kind of love story of love rekindling and coming back together. It is a damaged relationship which is repaired over the course of the story. Not entirely repaired, there's still fractures, but that's a type of love story which definitely can be told more often. Thank you for the emotes, and yes, poor kitten. Baba Yaga, she's all over the place. She's very talkative today, and that's just the way it goes. Now, there's definitely other examples. So we can go ahead. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, that is a romantic action movie. Not necessarily the best, but if you just look at it as an action movie with romantic elements, it's pretty fun. It's pretty fun. If you look at it just from the romantic side and the relationship story, it's also pretty interesting, pretty fun, and also, like many romantic movies, it takes a lot of shortcuts to fix or to bind two people. So that's just something you're going to expect from all fiction. They're going to take shortcuts. Baba Yaga, thank you. Just got to talk to the cat, and then she's fine. Oh. All right. So, now we're making progress in developing, crafting our story for our film. As soon as I start talking, she has to meow. Yeah. Baba, they're saying hi to you. Silver Fox says hi, Baba. Now she doesn't want to talk back. Give it 2 seconds. She'll start talking to us again. Yep, there it was. All right. I, she, Baba Yaga didn't say anything. She's not saying anything yet. I I let her know. I let her know. And Baba Yaga, do you want to say hi to Silver Fox? Nope. She's gonna wait till I'm well and good talking again, and then she's gonna go ahead and say something. Yes. And actor choices, that is fortunately something we don't have to concern ourselves with at this point of the crafting. But I probably wouldn't hire Angelina Jolie. That's me personally, but couldn't afford her anyway. Now, to continue on though, as we craft our story, as we craft our future film, your future film, or mine, or you know, how it goes, uh, we've discussed things like your theme and your genre, and these are really important because as you pick what story you want to tell, as you ask yourself, "What is my story?" and then you go ahead and you get your extra elements in. Silver Fox, it's not that she's ignoring you, it's just that she wants to be the most important person in the room right now. Baba Yaga just wants to be the most important person in the room. Case in point. Baba, do you want to say hi to Silver Fox now? She was very well behaved until I started live streaming. Just gonna put that out there. Now, getting back to the story elements, and there's so many story elements to consider. There's so much, and we start with the obvious, which is what is the story you want to tell, and then we pick our theme, and then we pick our genre. Um, and after we have our theme and our genre, we need to start asking additional questions. Is a theme doesn't necessarily determine who our cast or our characters are. Our genre doesn't necessarily determine who our cast and characters are. You can play an existential drama or horror, and you can have an incredibly large cast, or you can have a romance and have an incredibly small cast. But you can also reverse this, and you can have an existential drama where you have a cast of like one or two. A good example of this is the movie Moon. Now, Moon is an existential, dramatic sci-fi movie. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. The cast is two: a man alone on a space station, and the computer that talks to him and that he talks to. That's the cast. That's the whole cast. Now, you can also go really big. Now, if you take something like a sci-fi movie, which has very existential themes, um, and also lots of, so you can go something like an action style one like I Am Robot, which is very much an existential science fiction action movie. And yes, primarily we're paying attention to Will Smith and whoever did the voice of the robot, but there's also like a lot of people. There's a lot of people. You can go to something like Minority Report. Again, a lot of people in motion. You can go in the range of action fantasy movies that are also dramatic and also unlikely hero. You go to the Lord of the Rings, again, very large cast, lots of people doing lots of things, lots of movement, lots of story elements. Game of Thrones, very large cast. But you can also go the opposite direction. Last Man on Earth, which in and to itself sounds like there's going to be a cast of one, and it turns out there's actually a pretty big cast. Last Man on Earth, which was a television show, I think it's still running. It might not be, I'm not sure. Last Man on Earth starts with the premise of someone being the last man on Earth and very quickly introduces a bunch of other people, but maintains the name Last Man on Earth, which subverts its own initial premise quickly. Uh, then you can have other things where it seems like you have a big cast, but you're actually dealing with smaller elements of a singular entity. So in the 90s, there was a television show, a sitcom, which was primarily just a comedy, but it was Herman's Head. Now, in Herman's Head, there was actually a large cast of people. However, most of them existed entirely within Herman's Head. I actually want you to think about like the movie Inside Out, but happening, you know, a couple decades before Inside Out came out. You know, so and it was a really interesting show, had a really interesting premise. You had all of these actors playing the various voices and urges and thoughts uh, that were going on inside Herman's head. And we got to see them as people. Now, this idea was so good, and it didn't last nearly as long as it should have, but we got kind of a redux when Pixar created Inside Out. Now, Inside Out is more or less the exact same thing. They just did it in an animated version as opposed to a live action, and it was really good. It's really good. Inside Out, really good. Herman's Head, really good. I would recommend that if you can find episodes of Herman's Head online somewhere, you watch it just for the concept alone, so you can see kind of an initiation of what eventually would become a very popular trope also in fiction, which is anthropomorphizing uh, feelings. Now, the anthropomorphizing of feelings happens before Herman's Head came out, but I think Herman's Head gave it a really clear and distinct direction, which could be played off of for future fiction and media. I am so glad that you used to watch that. Um, it went off a year ago. Okay, cool. I caught some. I did not catch all of, but I caught some of The Last Man on Earth. I thought it was really interesting, but it very quickly lost me. That's not anything against the actors. Actors were great. Story concept was great. I just didn't really enjoy the way that it played out, and that's me personally. Now, we're still talking though, like, how are we going to build our story? So these are things to take into account. One, pick a theme. It doesn't have to be one, but it could be two. But we need a theme. We need themes, potentially, genre or genres, and decide how many characters there are. And with each additional character, you have to kind of account for how that affects your story. Now, some people are of the mind that if you are writing a story, you need a full understanding of each character. I would disagree. I don't think you need a full understanding of each character. What I personally think is that you need a rough concept of the motivations of each character. You don't have to know everything about a character's life, where they are, where they're going, but if you know what their motivations are, I think that's a strong place to be. And again, this is my opinion. There are many different opinions and many different ways to go about crafting characters in our various fiction. So take each one of these suggestions with a grain of salt and understand that it's not the only way we can do things. It is just a way, just one. And with each different way to go about things, you open up doors to creating the story you want to tell. I'm so glad this is helpful, and I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you, by the way, for being here. Um, so these are just all the different things that should be considered when you go to start crafting your story. Whether you're going to make it into a short film, which is my preferred medium, or a book even. You can actually consider just, because I am a writer and I've written, um, I have 10 publications, but, if you're writing a book, yeah, you're going to want to take these things into consideration. If you're writing a short film or even maybe a TV show or a skit, if you want to just do a skit and then post it up online, if you want to do a full feature-length film, these are things that you're going to have to consider. Now, when you watch movies where everything seems a little off, and not in a good way, sometimes it's because people couldn't stick to one of these things. Now, this is a very valid complaint that's been lodged against the first Suicide Squad movie as well as the Justice League movie, is that they couldn't decide on a theme or a genre. And when you watch the movies, they seem very disconnected, very janky, very uncohesive. And in many ways, it's because, and I agree, I agree with these perspectives, it's because they couldn't stick to a theme or to a genre when they put it together. They didn't have one singular cohesive vision. This, of course, has been blamed on everything from multiple writers to multiple directors to multiple producers. And that's okay, but I think the blame really should go to the fact that the people who were in charge didn't take charge. If you're a new director or a new producer or a new writer coming onto a pre-existing project, you should see what was being done before and you should take the lead of it. That's what you should do. And this also is going to go for an independent filmmaker or a small filmmaker, a short filmmaker, anyone who wants to do this. Say you go to work on someone else's project. If there's a clear direction, follow it. It will make a better story. It'll make something more compelling to watch. And that's really important. You can have a lot of fun watching something without a clear direction, but it's not as much fun as you would have if there was a solid image of where you were going and what you were viewing. So these are things to keep in mind. Now, someone like Sam Raimi, Sam Raimi's made tons of movies, and he's also been involved in a lot of TV shows. Sam Raimi is really good at taking disconnected genres and themes and putting them together into a singular movie. He can be remembered for Army of Darkness, Evil Dead, Evil Dead 2, the original Tobey Maguire Spider-Man series, those three movies, but also things like Hercules and Xena, the TV shows from the 90s. Sam Raimi has a great capacity to take horror elements and put them into an action movie and make it cohesive. He has a great capacity to take comedy and stick it into horror and have it be compelling and actually more frightening because of that. And I'm actually excited because Sam Raimi is going to be the one directing, uh, if I'm not mistaken, it's both Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, but he's also involved with Spider-Man No Way Home. This is exciting for me as both a enjoyer of cinema, but also an enjoyer of good stories and good directors and good writers. Um, so we're going to have to wait to see what goes on with that. But Sam Raimi did amazing work mixing in a lot of different themes and genres into a cohesive whole that made up the original three Spider-Man movies of the early 2000s. And seeing what he's going to be able to do now that he's coming back to like work on a really big Marvel movie, it's going to be fun. Now, to stop talking about that just for a moment, we really do need to continue discussing the craft aspects. And that comes down. So, say we picked out a theme, a genre, and we know how many characters we have. And also, we've taken the time to figure out the motivations of our characters. Now, after we have motivations, after we have a genre, after we have themes, after we have a cast, here's the part where we're going to go ahead and we're really going to dig in and start building the meat of our story. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm so glad that you're getting a lot out of this conversation. Film and storytelling and art and creativity, these are all very large aspects of what I enjoy, what I do, and this is something that I'm passionate about, and I would like to impart this to you. And hopefully help people out there who'd like to get into similar things. Storytelling, filmmaking, books, art, creation. So I'm glad that you're getting a lot out of this, and I'm glad you're enjoying it. All right. So when we go to start crafting the movie, when you start to go crafting your story, or when I start to craft my story, after we have things like our genre, our theme, our characters, our motivations, then we're going to come up with key scenes. Now, a lot of scenes in a movie, this is awful to say, depending on the filmmaker, but a lot of scenes in a movie can be taken out and you lose nothing. That's why it's so easy to edit things down to put on TV, to make PG, to go ahead and create multiple versions of the same film and still have it work. That's why there's things like director's cuts and producer cuts and extended cuts. Yes, happily. What you need in a movie is key scenes. Now, the key scenes have to be there. What do you need to start a film? So when you want to start a film, you're going to need your theme or themes, your genre or genres, your cast, and their motivations. So your characters and their motivations. After we have all of that, we need to come up with our key scenes. And key scenes are incredibly important. And you might only have a handful of them in a movie. In a feature-length film, all your key scenes are things that, without these scenes, the story doesn't make sense. Now, depending on the film and the filmmaker, the entire thing you see could be key scenes, or only like 2 or 3 are truly key scenes. Some are for things like character building, some are for world building, but the story itself, the plot, and the true cohesive image comes from key scenes. So with our key scenes in mind, you really create the flow of the film. And you can go ahead and you can come up with all those key scenes and make a rough outline of what each of those key scenes is, and put them down just on, you can draw out images, or you can write them down in scenes, and you can tack them all up to a board and move them around as you need to make everything make more sense. But those key scenes are the skeleton of your film. And those are harder to pick out when you watch a movie, but they are there. Now, in things like TV shows, short form content like that, where maybe it's 20 to 30 minutes of actual story, most of it is key scenes. But it also depends. If you're talking animated, maybe 2 to 3 scenes are key scenes. If you're talking live action, again, in short form, you could have, 2 to 3 key scenes, and then a lot which just helps flesh out the story and make it more cohesive and easier to follow. And in a movie, it's best to actually think about the entire movie, the entire film, as just a series of key scenes, and how you get from one scene to the next. So say we want to tell a revenge story, and this is going to be good for this illustration. So the revenge story is going to have some really crucial key scenes. Key scene number 1, and bear in mind, you can move these key scenes around. They don't have to stay in sequence so long as when everything is done, the viewer can follow. But a key scene for a revenge movie is going to be the igniting point for our main character. The point that creates it, so they need to seek out revenge. So for this, we're going to actually use John Wick. John Wick is a great movie. It's great cinema, and it's wonderfully put together. Now, John Wick doesn't start with the reason for revenge right away. What it actually starts with is a humanization of our hero, which is very important for the kind of story it is. But when they show the ignition point for the revenge story, it's actually it's several minutes into the movie. I think it's like 13 or 20 minutes into the movie when you actually get to see the reason that John Wick starts this revenge story. And that's important. It's really important, because if you take that out, the whole movie falls apart. You don't have a film anymore. It doesn't make sense. It's just gratuitous violence. However, John Wick takes an interesting approach to a revenge story. Its first key scene is actually a montage of scenes which humanize and truly get us to care about John Wick and his relationship with his dog, and that's kind of our cold open. But then we get the ignition point, which is actually the reason John Wick's revenge story starts. So, spoiler alerts, if you haven't seen John Wick, I do apologize, but I'm giving a spoiler alert. So, it spends the first several minutes of the movie building up an understanding that John Wick has this beautiful little puppy that he's taking care of that was a gift from his dying wife. His wife has passed away, and he's been loving this dog and regaining his hold on his will to live and actually just be a good person. And it's it's his connection to the wife that he lost. And that's how they start us off. So their first key scene is a set of scenes which all make us care about John Wick and care about this dog and care about and understand the meaning. And then starts our first true key scene to the revenge story after all of this, which is I'll back up a little bit. There's a key scene that comes beforehand, which is the ignition of the revenge story, which is John Wick just saying no to a bunch of criminals who want to buy his car from him. With this key scene, we go ahead and we start the revenge story because we've established just by the film that John Wick loves his dog, and then we establish this key scene where these criminals who clearly will do whatever they want to buy John's car, and John says no. The scene you get right after this, more or less, is the criminals breaking into John's home, beating him, and then beating his dog. It's violent, it's terrible, it makes you incredibly sad. And with the conclusion of that key scene, our revenge story has begun. John Wick loses this grasp on his wife, his life, his happiness, and the dog that was a representation of all that love. Now, without this scene, without the couple of scenes before it, but most certainly without this primary scene of the break-in of John Wick's home, the revenge story doesn't make sense. And I know that that seems quite obvious, but at the same time, it's very important. So when you craft your story, you have to think about each of the moments that without them, the story doesn't make sense. And that's the best way to think about your key scenes. I have to say this word so that this word after it creates a sentence, a phrase, an acknowledgement of the next thing. So in some ways, a film is like poetry, where one verse leads to another verse, leads to another verse. And there's a rhyming, there's a continuation, there's a clear direction, and then a beautiful resolution. And fun fact, when it comes to film, you don't actually have to resolve anything. And that's a bit of contention amongst some people. However, you don't actually have to give a neat and tidy resolution to everything. Or anything. You can end a film with nothing but a big old question mark, and sometimes that's incredibly satisfying. So satisfying. And sometimes, if you do that, people just leave the cinema and get so frustrated. However, Donnie Darko is a good example of this, where the conclusion of the film leaves you sometimes with a lot more questions than answers. When Donnie Darko ends, spoiler alerts, you don't really actually ever learn how time travel was possible. You don't learn what happens to the family. You don't learn if anyone who was a truly bad person in the film who's suddenly been caught in this weird time loop gets punished. You don't learn if there's actually any true implications to the story. You don't know. There's a big old question mark hanging right there. Alfred Hitchcock does this too. Uh, don't watch many films. Well, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to watch many films. I've seen more than enough for many people. That's not saying anything bad against myself, but I really love film. I really love creation, and so I've seen a lot of films and I've watched a lot of TV shows. I don't so much anymore, but I have all of this built up knowledge. Finding Cherry, I watch nothing but movies and documentaries. Perfectly fine. You can watch anything that you want, that you like. All right. So what's the difference between film and movie? Um, to be perfectly honest with you, there's just about no difference between a film and a movie. The words are mostly interchangeable, um, but technically, like a documentary is a film. Okay, so there's a semantic difference. There's a semantic difference. So a documentary is a film, and it can be a movie, but usually if you say movie, you're usually referring to something which is a story or something that's fictionalized. Film can just refer to anything that has been filmed. Movie sometimes can too, so these words are semi-interchangeable, so it's best to actually add some sort of distinction in your language to help people understand. But a film and a movie, they're pretty much the same thing. Um, pretty much. Technically, very few movies are films anymore. And there's a very good reason for this, is because not many people actually shoot on film anymore. Some still do, but not many people do. Yes. Um, so yeah, if it's shot on film, it's most certainly a film. But film is now a reference to a medium more than necessarily. Let me correct the way I said that. Film is more a reference to a type of art as opposed to the medium used to create said art. So you can shoot a digital film and it's still a film, but semantically speaking, it's not really shot on film, so it's not really a film, but it is a film because the way we use words changes and adjusts, and it's fine. So there are some differences, but they're mostly semantic differences, and they really depend on how you're using the words and the context and the situation. But a documentary most certainly is a film, and that's just the way it is. And things that are shot in purely digital are still films, even though no film is involved. Though to call it a movie is also perfectly fine. To call it cinema is also fine. So cinema, film, movie, all of these things refer to a similar variety of things, and it's purely linguistic and purely based on context, form, and usage. Though some people, such as Martin Scorsese, have argued that some movies being made right now aren't cinema, um, and I would disagree with him. Martin Scorsese might be legendary and he might be definitely an authority, but he's also, in many ways, a snob, in my opinion. So anything that doesn't fit neat and tidy into his worldview, he discounts, and that's okay. He's entitled to his opinion, though he has made some very, very um, incendiary remarks publicly in regards to modern movies not being cinema. And he is entitled to his opinion, and he can have it, and I politely disagree. uh, Cherry, I was talking about Martin Scorsese. Uh, Great filmmaker, great director, great writer. Um, has turned into, you know, kind of a jerk. But hey, okay, that's fine. It's your life. Live it. But we are coming to the end of all of this. So we've had a chance to talk a lot about um, how to put together your film, how to craft your story, uh, all these different things that can be poured into your creative process. And hopefully, through this conversation, you've gotten some useful information. Hopefully, this has been fun for you. I'm not going to drag on, but I will say, and just to kind of turn backwards and recap, when you go to make your film, your story, when you go to craft your thing, your creation, whatever it may be, uh, pick a theme or themes, pick a genre or genres, decide what your characters, your cast is going to look like, how many there's going to be, you know, small, big, somewhere in between. Um, Work out their motivations, and then consider your key scenes to your story. And after all of that, you can go ahead and you can form the complete image, which will be your film, your movie, your cinema, your creation. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Go get creative. You have to have an outlet. And I agree. I love movie talk too. Um, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation, today's topic. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope you've had a lot of fun. And be excellent, my friends. Go out, create your story, whether it's just in written form, whether it's musical, whether it's visual, whether it's a film or a skit or a web series, whatever it is, create it, embrace it, enjoy it, and truly learn to let yourself flow. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you all again real soon. I'll be back tomorrow, Sunday, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We're going to have a completely different kind of conversation, and I hope to see you there. Good night, and thank you for being here. Good night, Silver Fox. Good night, Finding Cherry. See you all again real soon.